When we think of survival, whether in nature, in history, or in our own lives, we often assume that strength alone is enough. We imagine that those who endure must possess an unshakable will, a superior intellect, or a unique skill that sets them apart. But strength by itself is not enough. Intelligence alone does not guarantee success. Even faith, as powerful as it is, does not function in isolation. Survival, true lasting survival, requires something more. It requires adaptation, and adaptation is not a single trait but a dynamic process. It is the ongoing relationship between faith, wisdom, and action. Faith provides the foundation, wisdom interprets the situation, and action applies what is necessary. If any one of these is missing, a person will struggle to navigate life's trials. The Bible does not glorify passive waiting or blind, reckless movement. Instead, it repeatedly shows that those who thrive in difficult times are those who learn to balance trust in God with understanding and decisive action. Joseph did not survive Egypt because he had dreams, but because he interpreted them wisely and acted accordingly. Esther did not save her people by believing alone, but by discerning the right moment to approach the king. Peter did not become the rock of the church overnight. He had to step out, fail, learn, and be refined. If we want to endure the storms of life, we must understand this. Survival is not about standing still. It is about learning when to trust, when to listen, and when to move. Faith is essential, but faith without wisdom leads to foolishness, and faith without action leads to stagnation. Imagine a farmer who prays for rain but refuses to plant his seeds. His faith in God's provision is misplaced because he has ignored the wisdom of preparation and the action of sowing. Likewise, a man who sees a storm coming but does nothing to protect his home cannot blame God when the winds tear it apart. Joseph's life exemplifies this truth. His faith in God's plan sustained him through betrayal, slavery, and imprisonment, but his faith alone did not free him. He had to recognize God's timing and interpret Pharaoh's dreams with wisdom. He had to take action by designing a plan to store grain for the famine. Had Joseph merely trusted without thinking or thought without acting, Egypt would have perished. But because he balanced faith, wisdom, and action, he was not only saved, but became a savior to others. The Israelites in the wilderness faced the same test. They had faith that God would provide manna, but when they ignored his instructions and hoarded it out of fear, the manna rotted in their hands. Faith that is not accompanied by wisdom and obedience becomes misplaced trust. Trust in one's own instincts rather than in God's command. Many believers fall into this trap. Some trust blindly without seeking understanding, walking into situations unprepared. Others analyze and strategize endlessly, yet never take the leap of faith to act. But true survival requires all three: the faith to trust God's provision, the wisdom to recognize his guidance, and the courage to take action. When life takes an unexpected turn, many struggle because they either cling to past methods or abandon faith altogether. But adaptation is not about abandoning faith, it is about refining our approach while remaining anchored in God. Esther's story is a perfect example. When Haman's decree threatened her people, she did not rush blindly into the king's presence, nor did she remain frozen in fear. Instead, she took time to fast and seek God's wisdom. Only then did she step forward and speak at the right moment. If she had acted too soon, she might have failed. If she had waited too long, the moment would have passed. True adaptation is knowing when to pause, when to listen, and when to move. Elijah also had to adapt. When the brook at Cherith dried up, he did not sit beside it waiting for God to fill it again. He moved when God told him to, seeking provision in Zarephath. Had he remained where he was, he would have perished. Sometimes God provides in one way for a season, but then calls us to move. If we refuse, we mistake the method for the provider. Faith must be flexible enough to follow when God shifts the path. When hardship comes, our first instinct is usually to adjust our external actions. But true transformation takes time. Behavioral change is the first step, but deep adaptation requires the alignment of our faith, wisdom, and actions over time. Peter's life illustrates this process. When Jesus called him, he immediately left his nets, his first act of faith. But his transformation did not happen overnight. He stepped out onto the water, only to sink when fear overtook him. He boldly declared his allegiance to Christ, only to deny him when the pressure became too great. Each of these moments was a behavioral adjustment, but they were not yet a complete transformation. It was only after Pentecost, when Peter's faith, wisdom, and action fully aligned, that he became the rock Jesus had prophesied. He no longer wavered in fear, but boldly preached before thousands. He no longer acted impulsively, but walked in Spirit-led wisdom. He no longer hesitated, but moved with conviction. Crisis teaches us to adjust, but true transformation happens when our heart, mind, and actions come into alignment with God's will. God does not expect instant perfection, but He does expect us to grow. The testing of faith, as James chapter 1 verses 2-3 tells us, is what produces endurance. Spiritual growth is not a straight path. It is a journey of learning, adjusting, and refining. Even Jesus demonstrated adaptation. He began his ministry in synagogues, but when opposition arose, he shifted to teaching on hillsides and in boats. When Pharisees sought to trap him, he answered them differently each time, adapting his approach to expose their hypocrisy. When the time for crucifixion came, he did not resist but submitted to the ultimate act of obedience. His mission never changed, but his methods adjusted to fulfill God's will at each moment. If Jesus himself moved in wisdom and action while remaining rooted in faith, how much more should we? Life is not about possessing a single defining trait that guarantees success. It is about maintaining a dynamic balance between faith, wisdom, and action. Faith alone is not enough if we lack wisdom to understand what God is doing. Wisdom alone is not enough if we do not act in obedience. And action alone is reckless if it is not grounded in faith. Many struggle because they overemphasize one and neglect the others. Some have faith but never act. Some act without seeking wisdom. Some rely on their own wisdom but lack the faith to trust in God's timing. But those who endure, those who thrive, are the ones who learn to integrate all three. Joseph endured because he trusted, understood, and acted. Esther prevailed because she prayed, discerned, and stepped forward. Peter transformed because he obeyed, learned, and grew. So must we. Are we standing still, waiting for life to change on its own? Or are we walking in faith, seeking wisdom, and taking action when God calls? Survival is not about resisting change. It is about learning to adapt without losing trust in the one who never changes.